And at least 35 massacres took place. And this is not from Palestinian historians. Israeli historians documented 35 massacres that took place during this period. So you had hundreds of thousands of Palestinians driven from their homes and land just in this first 6 months alone. They estimate about 250,000, 250,000 driven from their homes and land just in this first 6 months alone. And then the process continued. So this ethnic cleansing continued for 6 months. In the end, about 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes and land. And so many more were murdered, so many women were raped. This is well documented by the historians. But 800,000 driven from their homes and land. When we talk about the Palestinian refugees, right, the right of return of Palestinian refugees, we're talking about the descendants of these 800,000 people that were driven from their homes and land. I'll come back to this issue of right of return, but one thing we should remember is, can you tell me one other international conflict where refugees haven't been able to return to their home and land? Always it's the case. It's just the international standard. When you have war and then you have some resolution, the people get to return to their homes and land, except in this case, except in the case of Palestine. 800,000 driven from their homes and land and never to be returned. Now they number between 4 and 7 million people. We'll come back to that issue later. In May 1948, Israel declares the State of Israel. Okay, they declare their independence, they declare the State of Israel. Over 78% of historical Palestine. Now, if anyone who's been paying attention to what I've been saying knows that the UN only ever allocated 55%. How is it that they're declaring a state on 78% of historical Palestine? Basically, all of that territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, except the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. How do they declare a state over all of this area? How do they even come to possess anything more than that 55%? They did it through ethnic cleansing, and that's something the international community needs to answer for. Anyone who talks about, oh, the right of Israel to exist and, recognition of Israel, in that is recognition of ethnic cleansing. So which Western government is prepared to do that? Because that's the reality. That is the only way they came to possess that extra 23%, not through the UN, through ethnic cleansing. So let's all keep that in mind. It's only after Israel declares its state that any Arab army enters Palestine. No Arab army entered before then. After this declaration, then you see the armies from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, also some from Lebanon, even some from Iraq come. But Israel is very well equipped, very powerful. In fact, numerically, they had more troops than any of these Arab countries combined. Well, more troops than what the Arab countries were committing. Better weapons than what the Arab countries were committing. The only significant challenge was that mounted by the Arab Legion, which is basically controlled by Jordan. This is the only army that mounted any significant challenge. And what they were able to do was maintain control of the West Bank. So after this so-called War of 1948, which ended about a year later, 1949, 1950, we see Israel in possession of 78% of historical Palestine. The Gaza Strip, the area known as the Gaza Strip, was under the control of Egypt, and the West Bank, including Jerusalem, including Al-Quds, was under the control of Jordan. And this is how the situation remained for the next, say, 20 years. Until 1967, Israel again goes to war with Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. In this war, it captures the Gaza Strip and, in fact, the Sinai Peninsula as well from Egypt. It captures the West Bank, including Jerusalem, from the Jordanians, and it captures the Golan Heights from Syria. So it comes into possession of all of this territory. So today when they refer to the occupied territories or the occupied Palestinian territories, they're referring to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that were captured in 1967. And from this point on, the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are faced with a Israeli military occupation. And that situation has continued all the way up until today. One more thing that we should understand about this conflict is that there are a number of layers that have been built on. Now, I mentioned about the original problem, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. 800,000 driven from their homes and lands, so many massacres and so on. The property that the Israelis came to possess. Because when they drove the Palestinians from their land, from their homes, they captured all of their fruit groves, their olive trees, their citrus trees. They took their houses and they went and lived in their houses, and they brought more Jews from Europe and different parts of the world and put them in those houses, Palestinian houses. They just took over complete villages. That's the ones that they didn't raze to the ground. And anyone who's... I should have given some background about myself. My PhD thesis is on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I went there in 2006, and that's where I did my field research. And there are some places in Israel where they built these, beautiful, forests, because they're so environmentally friendly, so they build these wonderful forests. Those forests that they've built are built over Palestinian villages that have been razed to the ground, and all the people in those villages were massacred. That's where they built those parks and forests. Okay? So if you ever go there, look very closely at the ground, and in some places you'll actually see the foundations of people's homes, and they built forests over that to try and disguise the ethnic cleansing that took place. You can see it for yourself. Don't have to go far, go to Jerusalem and just go to the areas just around Jerusalem and you can see it for yourself. Okay, now coming back to this issue. 1967, Israel takes control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and they've continued a military occupation there, and I mentioned about multi-layers. Today, so it begins with the ethnic cleansing, and then you've got this military occupation that's been going on for now over 40 years. But you can add to that, within the West Bank, there's 500 plus checkpoints. Palestinians cannot go from one town to another without going through numerous Israeli checkpoints. Just to give you an example, the trip from here to Brisbane is about 40 minutes, right? Well, I live in Underwood, which is near Logan, about 40 minutes, nothing more than that. That's like going from Ramallah in the West Bank to Nablus, which is in basically the centre of the West Bank. And you can, if you're lucky, you can go from Ramallah to Nablus in about an hour. And I've made that journey. To leave there, you line up for at least 2 hours. This is on a good day. Usually people have to bring an overnight bag because they close the checkpoint, you have to sleep there. But 2 hours, you line up, men, women and children, babies crying, hungry, suffering, people needing to go to work, people needing to go to school, so on and so forth. The Israeli military at these checkpoints, they don't care. They point guns on people, harass people, treat people like animals. You line up for 2 hours and eventually you get through that checkpoint to get out of Nablus. Then you have to hop into a little taxi or little small bus. And then you drive for how long? 5 minutes. Another checkpoint. Everybody out. Check the whole car. One guy with me had fruit. He was a fruiter. And so he had boxes of fruit that he wanted to send, to the next town. Every box has to be checked because there might be something in there, whatever, all of this nonsense. So that journey, basically going from here to Logan, right? 40 minutes, 5 hours. How can any society function like that? I met people, and for us Muslims, family is very important. You visit your parents and your relatives constantly. I met people in places like Ramallah who had never seen their own mother, for more than 6 months, and she only lives 40 minutes away. Never seen their mother for 6 months because the journey is too hazardous because of these checkpoints. People can't get to school. People can't get to their jobs. How can an economy function? How can goods be delivered when you've got this sort of situation, these blockades? Even the World Bank has acknowledged that the biggest problem facing the Palestinian economy is Israel, and specifically these Israeli checkpoints. So this is another layer.